So without further ado, I'm going to turn you over to Amanda, who I've already introduced, but I'll remind you that she's the founder and director of the Beckley Foundation and co-directs the Beckley Imperial Research Program with Professor Nutt, who'll be speaking after her. So Amanda, thank you very much for joining us. Help me welcome Amanda, please. That's okay. You're worth waiting for.
Hello, everyone. I hope you won't mind having seen me in the morning, seeing me again. Well, after decades of draconian drug laws and repressive stigma obstructing the development of psychedelic research, we are finally seeing a new dawn. Clinical studies are progressing at a pace. Neuroimaging is breaking new ground in helping explain the mechanisms underlying the action of these drugs, and the media are awash with stories of the therapeutic power of psychedelics. There's an increasing clinical evidence of something that users of psychedelics have always known, that these drugs are invaluable tools with which to unlock the deeper levels of the psyche, and that they can transform the individual in profound and beneficial ways that are the new neural transformational medicines of the future. The combination of psychedelics and brain imaging enables us to study the mind and consciousness, the very things that define our quality of life, and indeed the human condition, at a new level. And interest in consciousness is where my own personal journey began. I grew up in a very isolated rural situation with nothing much to do except drift around dreaming of possible realities. Later, this developed into a passion for mysticism and the unifying mystical state of different religions. William James and Aldous Huxley had both been family friends of my grandparents, and perhaps the ideas of these men silently permeated the environment. James had declared that compared with what we ought to be, we're only half awake, a sentiment that has resonated with me throughout my life. Huxley's idea about the brain as a reducing valve, constraining consciousness, always made sense to me, and in many ways predicted the findings of our neuroscientific research today. At 16, I left school early because the nuns refused to allow me books on Buddhism. I then studied under the world's leading expert on mysticism, Professor Zehner of All Souls in Oxford. He had recently written Mysticism, Sacred and Profane, which designated his own psychedelic experience as profane. It was some years later, in 1965, that I took my first LSD and realized that he was wrong, and that far from being profane, the experience was spiritually profound. It clearly exposed the different states of consciousness hiding behind the filmiest of screens that William James had described. Unfortunately, in 1966, a malintentioned individual who ran the World Psychedelic Center in Chelsea and who had turned leery onto his first LSD trip spiked my coffee with thousands of doses of LSD, which he kept in a famous vinegar bottle. Once I regained my consciousness, I retreated to a hut in the countryside and pulled the fragments of my shattered psyche back together again. This might have put me off psychedelics for life, but by good faith, I soon after met Bart Huges, a Dutch scientist of exceptional insight, who had developed a hypothesis of how LSD worked in the brain, and how one can maintain control over one's expanding consciousness by ensuring a sufficient supply of vitamin C and glucose. Because we fell in love, I pulled myself together and dived back into our life enhanced by LSD. In those early days, before Prohibition, we took large doses on a regular basis to enhance and sharpen our cognitive abilities. We wanted to maintain our concentration in order to gain a deeper insight into the human condition and to build up a better understanding of the importance of the ego and of its role in forming a filter between external reality as it is and the internal perception of it. We humans are unique in having developed this ego mechanism, which is based on word recognition. It underlies our brilliance, but also our neurosis and psychopathologies. Barth's hypothesis was that altered states of consciousness brought about by psychedelics are based on an increased volume of blood in the brain capillaries, thereby providing more brain cells with oxygen and glucose. His other major insight was that the first scientific description of the ego as a conditioned reflex mechanism which controls the distribution of blood in the brain. With a better understanding of the ego and the mechanisms underlying the altered states, we were able to use the LSD experience, both to enhance our working abilities and to delve deeply into the psyche and wash out repressed trauma. I felt as if I had passed through a portal of new understanding, both of myself and of humankind. It was then that I decided I'd found my mission in life, to scientifically research these changing states of consciousness and their potential value for the individual and humanity, and to integrate this knowledge into modern society. However, as a female with a vision, but no letters after her name and little money, how can one change global drug policy and undertake controversial scientific research into psychedelics and consciousness? Answer: become a foundation. So, in 1996, I did just that, and set up the Foundation to Further Consciousness, later renamed the Beckley Foundation. I gained credibility by getting the best scientists in the field onto my scientific advisory board, starting with Albert Hofmann. My first scientific endeavor to investigate the truth of our hypothesis was in 1998 with Franz Vollenweider. Using PET, we investigated the changes in blood supply in the brain brought about by psilocybin. The results were positive, but the paper, sadly, was never published. However, in these early days, my main focus was on policy change, because psychedelics had become so taboo that it was almost impossible to find scientists or institutions willing to get involved and to face the regulatory barriers to conducting the research, particularly if there was a possibility of positive findings which could ruin their career. I set about organizing a series of international seminars at the House of Lords, to which I invited leading scientists, politicians, and experts. Key policy issues were debated that shed light on the harms of the present prohibitionist approach and how best to develop new policies to reduce harms, improve health, cut costs, and respect human rights. Through the Beckley Foundation, we produced reports and books and set up organizations, which later became independent. We presented at the UN and advised international governments. Slowly, attitudes began to change. The devastation caused by the unintended fallout of the war on drugs was far beyond the damage of the drugs themselves. I think there's been no other civil issue which has caused such unnecessary suffering worldwide. The drug laws, which were created by the US through the mouth of the United Nations, were based on misconceptions and political expediencies. Although they have shown themselves to be a total failure, they are set in stone like the Book of Mormon. Hundreds of billions of dollars are spent each year, prisons are filled, tens of thousands die, corruption is rampant, and the flow of drugs just increases. There has been no commitment to reviewing, let alone reversing, these policies. I watched the drug war take root in the early 70s and grow like a cancer through the flesh of society. It is a clear reflection of the mistakes that man can make because of the interference of a misinformed ego. Surprisingly, however, the US, which prohibits the rest of the world from reforming its drug policies, has made great strides itself in reforming cannabis policy, a testament to the fact that change can and will occur. Decades from now, people will puzzle at the absurdity of our current drug laws and be appalled by the suffering they have caused. Among the sources of suffering is the fact that research into the healing potential of psychedelics and cannabis has virtually been blocked, so millions of people have been deprived of psychedelic-assisted therapy which could have improved or healed their conditions. For many years, I found myself caught in a catch-22. Policy reform was impossible without scientific evidence to support it, and scientific research was impossible without policy reform. But now, after nearly 2 decades of slow advance on both fronts, the tide has turned, and Catch-22 has been replaced with a positive feedback loop, where groundbreaking research will hopefully lead to policy reform, a widening of research, and the availability of psychedelic medicines. During my 18 years as director of the Beckley Foundation, I have established collaborative programs with scientists and universities around the world. A major breakthrough happened in 2005 when I joined forces with Dave Nutt to relaunch the psychedelic research in the UK. As this had not been done for decades, we started with cannabis, as Dave doubted we would get approvals for LSD, which was what I most wanted to do. Later, Robin Cahard-Harris joined us, and when in 2009 Dave moved to Imperial, we launched the Beckley Imperial Research Program with our first brain imaging studies on psilocybin. We have since carried out pioneering brain imaging studies with MDMA, LSD, and now DMT. It has been a wonderfully productive partnership, and I'm delighted to be working with Dave, Robin, and now the larger team. Another exciting collaboration has been with Jordi Reba in the forming of the Beckley São Paulo research program. This is concentrated primarily on ayahuasca, although we are now starting the first research to investigate 5-MeO DMT in comparison with DMT. Our research is confirming what we had expected, that psychedelics can provoke powerful, often transcendental experiences and can lead to positive changes in mood, well-being, and personality traits, persisting for days, weeks, or even years. Results from our 2015 Beckley Imperial investigation of psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression were remarkable. 67% of subjects who received 2 doses of psilocybin, one of which was very low, were in remission 1 week after taking psilocybin, and 42% remained depression-free after 3 months. This was an unprecedented achievement, as participants had suffered from depression for an average of 18 years and had failed to respond to any other treatment. In 2014, within the Beckley Imperial Research Programme, we started the first ever brain imaging study with LSD in human subjects. This study was particularly close to my heart, as I'd wanted to do it since the 60s and had made a promise to Albert Hofmann to reintegrate his problem child into the scientific world for his 100th birthday present. One of our key results was a dramatic increase in global connectivity across the brain. Brain regions that do not usually communicate with each other became highly connected under LSD, resulting in a more integrated brain. In addition to more connectivity across the entire brain, we found that LSD reduced communication between certain regions of the brain that are responsible for creating a narrative self, namely the parahippocampus and the posterior cingulate cortex. These changes were associated with participants reporting feeling that their normal sense of self had been altered or lost entirely. Many aspects of selfhood can be attributed to the functioning of a brain network called the default mode network, the DMN, which is active when we are not focused on a specific task, but rather reflecting on our personal past, present, and future. Normal functioning of the default mode network affords a relative stability to this sense of self. However, overactive DMN can result in maladaptive thought patterns, ruminations, and compulsive behaviors that become over-dominant and entrenched and seemingly inescapable. These can manifest as a sense of hopelessness for personal change, contributing to the development of mental illness, such as depression and addiction. Knowing that the DMN is overactive in mental illnesses, we were interested to see that the psychedelics, namely psilocybin, LSD, and ayahuasca, have all been shown to lessen the censoring control of the default mode network. Many of the changes of the default mode network were associated with alterations in the normal sense of self, and in our ayahuasca studies with Geordie, we found certain changes in the DMN to be associated with improved abilities for mindfulness, particularly an ability to decenter. Decentering is the capacity to observe your thoughts and feelings rather than closely identifying with them, so that you can be less judgmental and reactive towards them. The ability to decenter, whether natural or fostered by meditation, has been strongly linked to a reduced risk of mental illness. In our study, participants' score after a single dose of ayahuasca was similar to those of experienced meditators with many years of training. Interestingly, our Beckley Sun Power research has also revealed a shrinking in the posterior cingulate cortex among regular ayahuasca users. The posterior cingulate cortex is part of the brain's default mode network, and its shrinking was found to correlate with increases in mindful-related traits, such as self-transcendence and openness. We're only just beginning to untangle the mechanisms underlying the psychedelics, but it appears that our healing capacity comes largely from the interruption of the repressive control of the default mode network. The psychedelics can reset fixed patterns of behavior, rebooting the mind so that the compulsive voice of need or depression is quietened. For those who are not suffering from a particular ailment, the experience of diminishing the repressive power of the default mode network and stimulating the whole of the brain to communicate can lead to a looser style of cognition, more prone to making new associations, increasing intuitive pattern recognition, facilitating spontaneous self-insight, fresh perspectives, and enhanced creativity. I think that psilocybin is now well on the road to getting recognized as a drug with medical benefits. We have demonstrated its remarkable power to help people overcome addiction and depression and the existential fear of dying. And it has been proved to reliably stimulate the mystical experience, which plays a key role in its therapeutic effects. However, while LSD can most likely do everything that psilocybin can do, it is the Cinderella of psychedelics, wrapped in 50 years of toxic media. It is the baby chick just cracking out of its shell. I have a great fondness of birds. I'm dedicated to righting this wrong and to carrying out research which will demonstrate its great value. I'm currently undertaking a series of studies investigating the mechanisms underlying LSD's action, as well as resuming the research started in the 50s to investigate its efficacy in the treatment of alcohol addiction. It is good to remember that Bill Wilson, the founder of AA, was a keen advocate of LSD in the treatment of addiction, but was overruled. Another study I'd like to mention harks back to the days when I was a keen Go player. I found that I won more games on LSD, indicating to me its power to increase intuitive pattern recognition and creativity. In addition to using the game of Go as a test for enhanced creativity, this brain imaging study will investigate whether and how microdosing LSD can improve mood, productivity, and cognition. I hope that expanding the research into LSD will help to lift the taboo of this extraordinary compound that has such an array of potential applications. We are now at the stepping stones, crossing from one bank to another. We're in the process of overcoming some of the mysteries. We're in the process of uncovering some of the mysteries of consciousness by lifting the veils to a clearer view of the mind's potential, and thus fulfilling the instructions of the Delphic oracle to know thyself. Thank you very much.